Flexible Exports Setup and Configuration. This is specifically for South Australia. The Flexible Exports requirements starts as of the 1st of July 2023. This presentation will basically be going through with you all of the requirements for setting up and configuring and commissioning a system. So to start with, compliance to flexible exports can come through in three different ways. So South Australian Power Network, so SAPN, has a utility server. The utility server will communicate either directly or indirectly with an inverter to manage the export requirements. So the way in which that does that, like I said, it's either direct through to an inverter with native compliance, or indirectly either through a gateway device or via the cloud. All of these mechanisms are through IEEE 2030.5 or the CSIP Oz communication protocol. That communication between the utility server and one of the devices is prescribed. What is non-prescribed is how, let's say, a gateway device would communicate with an inverter. So for all SolarEdge systems, we currently have the native compliance only, and that covers all of our single phase, three phase and commercial inverters, as well as multiple inverter combinations. When you look at the Clean Energy Council list of inverters with a software communication client, again, you'll see all SolarEdge inverters listed as having inverter inbuilt software client. This may change in time as gateway devices may well be incorporated to communicate with SolarEdge inverters. So we recommend that you keep going back to this list on the Clean Energy Council website to check the communication options. So now let's look at the actual installation, commissioning and configuration process. So step one, you need to install the inverter. So first thing, as most installers in South Australia will already be very familiar with, you need to apply to SAPN for the connection as usual using their Smart Apply portal. What's important here though is that the NMI number, the National Meter Identifier number, NIMI number, is entered correctly. So then go ahead, once the approval has been granted, go ahead and install the SolarEdge system. But what's important is you need to ensure that the SolarEdge meter, either the Modbus or inline meter, is used. With our home hub inverters, the Modbus meter comes as part of the inverter, so for those systems all you need to do is add the CT. You then go through and commission the inverter as usual using SetApp, ensuring that the inverter has an internet connection, and then apply a zero export limit to the site before you leave site. This will be updated once Flexible Exports registration has been completed. So anyone that isn't already familiar with the SetApp app, that is available to any smart device. It's used by SolarEdge accredited installers to be able to commission any SolarEdge inverter, or it can be used by anybody else which wants to be able to gain access to the inverter as a view-only option to be able to look at its status and also to be able to check what software and what settings are being applied. So you go through, download the app, you set it up, so an installer will need to log in with their email and password, which has been assigned to them after completing our accreditation course, and then go through and set up the activation of SetApp. So to be able to access an inverter and be able to go through the commissioning process, you then scan the QR code on the side of the inverter, you then flick the toggle switch and then basically approve the connection via Wi-Fi to the inverter. Via SetApp, if required, the device will then carry out a firmware update of the inverter. So once connected, you can then go through to one of the most important processes within the commissioning is the country and language section, and choose Australia Zone A, which is the correct grid code for all South Australian installations. What is an optional section which you'll now find on SetApp, so this is SetApp version 2.21 or later, there is a Flexible Exports Compliance Reminder. So what this is, you'll notice it on SetApp, it's basically explaining that as of the 1st of July, Dynamic Exports Compliance is a thing in South Australia, and it basically triggers you to record the NMI number, so it helps you identify the correct number, where to find the number, and also the amount of characters that the NMI should be in. So what it actually allows you to do is be able to enter, once you select South Australia Power Networks, you can then enter a NIMI number, and it will basically check that the NIMI is the correct format, the correct amount of digits. What's important is that number is recorded, because as part of the actual commissioning process, you need to enter the NIMI number into the monitoring platform. Once you've gone through those stages, then you can go ahead and process the normal commissioning stages of the inverter as normal. So step 2 is then to register the inverter with SAPN, and like I said before, this is done through the SolarEdge monitoring portal. So you need to log into the monitoring as usual. If a site doesn't exist, complete the site creation process, and most importantly, associate the inverter with the site as usual. Again, you'll see a pop-up on this one telling you that the dynamic export compliance submission is required, and it will ask you to navigate towards the dynamic exports tab. So basically that is under the site details. You'll now find a new dynamic exports tab, and in there you then enter the SAPN network or the utility provider, and you're then also asked to enter the NIMI number. So select SA Power Networks from the drop down menu and then enter the NIMI number and click submit. Then basically what happens is that is then creating a connection between the device and SAPN's utility server. And if all is good, if you've entered the correct NIMI number and the inverter serial number is correct, then they will create the connection, and the connection will be established, and you'll basically get a positive result. Sometimes this will happen in a couple of minutes, but sometimes, especially in busy periods, it may take a few days, but you'll get a notification there that the submission is pending. If for any reason that the NIMI is not found, you might need to re-enter that, or if the inverter serial number is incorrect, you then might need to go back to the admin tab, logical layout, and ensure that the correct serial number of the inverter has been recorded within the monitoring portal as well. If you select the wrong network, you'll basically just get a notification that flexible exports or dynamic exports is not a requirement yet in that locality, so stay tuned. So once you've done that step, we're on to step 3. You then have to go back to the SAPN Smart Install app, and there's a whole section within their new web page under embedded generation training, which had a load of guides and additional information for installers. But anyway, on the Smart Install app, you then submit the NIMI and inverter serial number. That will then connect SAPN with SolarEdge to confirm the identity of the inverter and that it's communicating okay. And then SAPN will basically execute an automated test to validate the dynamic curtailment capability. So basically SAPN via the utility server will be checking the inverter metrics and also be performing a dynamic curtailment process lasting a few minutes, and then you'll get a pass or fail result. If it passes, SAPN will then set the dynamic limit for the site, and the system will operate as usual because the site is now registered for dynamic exports. So just to cover a couple of things here. So what's important, because SAPN are going to be performing a dynamic curtailment process, you have to do these checks when there is actually solar production and solar production being exported. So if you were, for instance, to try to run this test at 8 o'clock at night, you're not going to have any production, so there's not going to be the ability for SAPN to curtail any production, so it will fail the test. The other thing worth noting is in that initial step when the inverter is installed and you're setting that 0 export limit, what this process does, because it then it's got to be able to create a curtailment, the first thing it's doing is releasing that 0 export threshold. It's then allowing export, and it will then curtail the export. As long as that all works correctly, it then basically resets everything, and the site will be able to export as usual until such time as SAPN need to apply a dynamic curtailment request. If there are any issues, obviously SolarEdge has its support, so via the app you can go to the support section and then you get the different options of how to communicate, but we then have the chat function on the app which should be able to help you very quickly and easily with ensuring that you've got this SAPN setup process happening correctly. So let's quickly recap then. The process overview is step 1. You need to gain approval from SAPN for the install. Via their smart apply, you need to commission via SetApp the installation once it's all in, set the system to Australia Zone A, and also set the site to 0 export. Step 2, you need to register the site with SolarEdge and SAPN, so that is done via the SolarEdge monitoring portal. Go to the Dynamic Exports Compliance Submission page on the Admin tab and add the NIMI data, or the NIMI number. Then step 3, execute a SAPN post-registration test. So log into the SAPN Smart Install app, submit the NIMI number and the inverter serial number. SAPN will then connect with SolarEdge to confirm the identity of the inverter and it's communicating. They will then execute the automated test procedure to validate the dynamic curtailment capability. So thank you very much. Hopefully that is all clear. If you have any further questions, please feel free to contact SolarEdge.